Steve Austin, astronaut, a man barely alive. That line opened one of the most iconic television shows of the 1970s. The $6 Million Man was part science fiction, part Cold War fantasy, a thrilling story about a pilot rebuilt with experimental technology after a devastating crash. But what most people didn't know is that the crash footage shown to millions each week wasn't fiction at all. On May 10, 1967, a NASA prototype known as the M2F2 was released high above Rogers Dry Lake. At the controls was Bruce Peterson, an experienced test pilot, flying an unpowered descent. But as the aircraft neared the ground, it began to roll, then struck the lakebed and tumbled across the desert in a violent chain of impacts. Like Austin, Peterson survived, but just barely. And without his consent, the worst day of his flying career became a television spectacle. In August 1960, Bruce Peterson arrived at NASA to work as an engineer at the Dryden Flight Research Center. With bigger and larger dreams in his mind, only 2 years later, he completed training at the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards, the very gateway to flying experimental aircraft in the most unforgiving conditions possible. But Peterson's entry into flight testing was anything but ordinary, almost as if the test pilot was somehow jinxed. In 1962, on his first flight aboard the Paraceb, a powered Rogallo wing glider NASA was exploring for spacecraft recovery, the short trek ended in a fiery crash from just 10 feet off the ground. The impact was minor, and through it all, the always calm and collected Peterson only made a simple technical comment, quote, "What happened to the lateral stick forces?" This incident wasn't the last time things went sideways. Peterson's flight logs over the next few years were filled with some of the most unpredictable machines of their era. He flew the North American F-10, the first United States-made fighter capable of supersonic speed in level flight, the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, the General Dynamics F-111 with its variable sweep wings and early fly-by-wire complexities, and the B-52, whose size masked the subtlety required to handle it during launch and recovery operations for drop test aircraft. In each case, Peterson brought a steady hand and a systems-oriented mind. While the Apollo program was capturing national attention with its push to put a man on the moon for the first time, a quieter effort was underway at NASA's Dryden Flight Research Center in California. Beginning in 1963, a team of engineers shifted their focus to a critical issue: how to bring spacecraft back to Earth without relying on parachutes or ocean landings. The goal was to develop a vehicle that could re-enter the atmosphere from orbit and land just like every other aircraft on a runway, controlled, reusable, and piloted. To do this, they began working with lifting bodies, experimental aircraft that relied not on wings, but on the shape of the fuselage itself to generate lift during descent. The earliest testbed was the M2F1, a lightweight frame constructed from steel tubing and plywood, covered in fabric and aluminum skin. The model had no onboard power, no pressurization, and was towed into the air behind a C-47 or a Pontiac convertible for its early runs. Nicknamed the Flying Bathtub for its blunt, curved shape, though it looked improvised, the data it returned on basic lift and control behavior was solid enough to justify building a heavier, more capable successor. This became the M2F2, developed by Northrop in collaboration with NASA. Its name stood for Manned and Flight, and the aircraft was compact, just over 22 feet long, with a short, squared wingspan of a little more than 9 feet. Its internal systems were designed to accommodate both unpowered glide flights and powered configurations, using a liquid-propelled rocket engine, fueled by ethyl alcohol and liquid oxygen, the first of its kind in America. It could produce up to 6,000 pounds of thrust, although most missions during its flight program were gliding descents from high altitude. The M2F2's first captive flight, carried safely beneath the wing of a modified B-52 Stratofortress, took place on March 23, 1966. Through it all, it remained bolted to its pylon mount, allowing engineers to assess structural loads, mounting stability, and flight dynamics without the added variable of separation, acting as a final systems check before the real test began. On July 12th of that same year, NASA test pilot Milton O. Thompson took the M2F2 on its first free flight. Released from 45,000 feet above the Mojave, the craft dropped cleanly away from the B-52 mothership, entering a steep glide as it arced toward the Rogers Dry lakebed below. Within seconds, Thompson was accelerating through 450 miles per hour, fast enough for aerodynamic control surfaces to bite, slow enough for descent to remain manageable. During this brief mission, Pilot Thompson stabilized the lifting body, maintained his descent profile, and brought it down in a controlled landing, all without power, and all inside a frame that had never flown before. From then on, the M2F2 flew over a dozen unpowered glide tests over Rogers Dry Lake, with early flights focused on basic controllability and damper tuning, with pilots gradually expanding the flight envelope and refining approach techniques. Thompson was not the only pilot to take part in this series. Bruce Peterson's first flight aboard the M2F2 occurred on September 15, 1966, during a high-altitude unpowered glide, released from 45,000 feet, a standard pilot checkout to familiarize him with the vehicle's handling. He then returned to the cockpit a week later, on September 22nd, for a second flight, focused on evaluating the aircraft's stability and control response with the onboard dampers engaged. But even as procedures improved and crews adjusted, one problem stayed. Because the M2F2 lacked traditional wings, lift and control came from the curvature of its fuselage. This gave the aircraft poor roll authority, especially at low speeds. So once the M2F2 was near the ground, just as the vehicle slowed and lined up for landing, it could start to sway and oscillate uncontrollably. Though the problem had been studied, logged, and managed, engineers simply couldn't find a way to fix it. Soon, this issue would come to a head. On May 10, 1967, the 16th glide flight of the M2F2 began like the others, a high-altitude drop from a B-52 bomber over Rogers Dry Lake, followed by a long, unpowered descent toward the desert floor. At the controls was, once again, Bruce Peterson, gliding the wingless lifting body aircraft down through increasingly unstable air. But by the time the vehicle reached the lower atmosphere, it was clear this flight would not be routine. As Peterson brought the M2F2 in on final approach, the aircraft began to roll. Not hard, but just enough to feel out of sync. Trying to remain calm, he banked slightly left to counter the drift, but the vehicle responded by overshooting and rolling back the other way. This cycle repeated several times, and as the prototype became more and more unstable, Peterson, hands on the stick, tried to stabilize the vehicle, but it overcorrected, setting up a dangerous feedback loop, a pilot-induced oscillation. As he continued fighting the controls, Peterson neared touchdown. He spotted a rescue helicopter that seemed to pose a dangerous collision threat. Just then, he was heard saying, quote, "Get that chopper out of the way. That chopper's gonna get me, I'm afraid." Momentarily distracted, and now drifting off center line, he found himself descending over an unmarked stretch of the lakebed, just outside the designated landing area. But without the visual reference markers painted on the runway, it was nearly impossible to judge altitude. Facing danger, Pilot Peterson fired the landing rockets, a last-second maneuver designed to give the aircraft an upward push, just enough to reposition or extend the glide. But it was too late. With the landing gear failing to fully lock into place, the M2F2's nose impacted the ground. A millisecond later, the airframe bounced, skipped once, and began to tumble. It rolled violently, over and over, in a series of brutal and uneven cartwheels. Finally, on the sixth rotation, the cockpit struck hard and inverted, crumpling the fuselage and burying the damaged vehicle in the dust. Peterson, injured but alive, was pulled from the wreck by Jay King and Joseph Huxman and rushed to the base hospital. After a series of surgeries, though Peterson lost all vision in his right eye, he otherwise recovered. Wearing an eye patch, the pilot continued to work on support missions, research flights, and continued his flying duties with the Marine Reserve. By his retirement in 1971, Peterson had flown almost 70 different vehicles and logged more than 6,000 flight hours. But it was his 1967 close call flight that became infamous. The crash was captured on film from multiple angles, which is standard operating procedure for flight testing at Edwards. In the years that followed, the same footage was lifted out of its context and stitched into the opening sequence of The $6 Million Man, a cult classic 1970s TV show about an injured test pilot rebuilt with experimental bionics. Week after week, the brutal images of Bruce Peterson's final flight in the M2F2, from the moment the craft hit the lakebed and the airframe came apart, were watched by millions of Americans who remained unaware they were watching a real accident. Even the pilot himself later stated he did not approve of his crash being televised. Rather than end the program, NASA chose to rebuild. Engineers at Dryden salvaged what they could from the damaged airframe and began modifying the design. The end result was the M2F3, which featured a third vertical stabilizer mounted between the original tip fins, a subtle addition that significantly improved handling. The new and improved M2F3 flew 27 times between 1970 and 72, completing the flight program that the M2F2 had started. Years later, when the space shuttle touched down on desert runways not far from where Peterson's flight ended, it carried with it the quiet traces of those early glides and the men who flew them.